South Atlantic Board will start in 3 minutes. Okay, it looks like we're ready to start. Russ is telling me I'm going to try to break Russ's record of 17 minutes for a board meeting. I don't think that's possible, but I'll try. My name is Pat Gear, and welcome to the Sorry about that, Joe. Is that better? Okay, welcome to South Atlantic Board. My name is Pat Gear. I'm the new chairman. You all have an agenda and the proceedings. If there's no comments about the proceedings from the August meeting, and is there any changes to the agenda? Hearing none, the only thing I'd like to add is that we have to elect a vice chair, so we'll do that at the end of the meeting. If there's no other comments about that, we'll consider the agenda and the proceedings from the August meeting approved. Now is the time for public comments. We've had one person want to make a very, very brief comment, and he's going to send out an email to all of us with the photograph that's associated with it, and that's Kelly Place. Kelly?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I didn't expect to be here, but I just wanted to bring something to the board's attention that has pretty significant trophic implications, at least in the Chesapeake Bay. And that's basically that the superabundance of channel bass, puppy drum, red drum that we see right now in the bay, as far as I can tell from my research, is far in excess of whatever's been seen in living memory or recorded history. I won't trouble you with the empirical observations we've made over time, except to say I've never, in this cold of temperature, seen fish dig crabs out of the mud as deep as they ever go, like they are now. That's the one picture I think that Kirby will email to you. I've spent my life kind of protecting red drum. I've never opposed any restriction. My family has fished for red drum since the 19th century and pretty much revered this fish. But I do want to bring to your attention that the sheer unprecedented biomass in all the rivers and estuaries in Virginia, and from what I understand, Maryland too, I believe presages unsuccessful year classes of just about all the finfish that we'll see, and apparently with crabs too. Not my words, but the Bay Foundation. I would suggest people read their centerfold article on the red drum, the reason for their abundance, and what the effects will be. You can get it online through the Bay Foundation, but two quick quotes is one, when drum populations rise, crab populations fall, and that predatory fish, including red drum and striped bass, are likely suspects in this crab disappearance. We had a great abundance of juvenile crabs last year, probably as a result of significant crab restrictions that VMRC put on, which were quite warranted. Everybody's happy with the success. All of a sudden, the superabundance of juvenile crabs has just disappeared. I believe that the unprecedented biomass of channel bass there will probably in the future bring some requests to you. I would not be surprised if people come asking that the recreational fishery bag limit, which is 3, be trebled, or that the commercial fisheries ask for a small bycatch allowance. Just wanted to put that on your table because I see, from what I can see, if it's accurate, we're going to have some serious trophic implications with regard to survival of the young of the year of all of our catadromous and anadromous species, as well as any other species such as crabs that are subject to predation from this superabundance. Just want to put that on your radar. I'm not asking for action. I suspect someone will in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kelly. We appreciate that. Okay, the next item on the agenda, last meeting back in August, we had a discussion about the traffic light analysis for spot and croaker, and I think it was Mr. Woodward had asked that the croaker TC and the spot PRT go back and look at that and hash that a little bit more, and they've done that, and Chris McConnell from South Carolina is going to go ahead and give us an updated presentation on that. Chris?
All right. Okay, the concern in what Harry Rickbaugh, when you guys heard this before in August, was that the current annual trigger exercises for both spot and croaker because they typically cover just the year or two previous index averages for the various trigger indexes, don't really look at changes that occur over longer periods of time. And in the case of Croker, it was looking at 70% of the previous 2-year average at a minimum, where examination of the data would be required. And with Spot, it was looking at the 10th percentile of those index values. And both species use commercial and recreational harvest, as well as the NIMS Fall Groundfish Survey, the CMAP survey in the South Atlantic, and then a couple other individual state surveys. But both of those management trigger schemes don't really, as I said, don't really illustrate the long-term declines or increases, and don't make comparisons over those longer time periods. And because they're both short-lived species, relatively, compared to something like red drum, you're going to get a high degree of annual variability. And so looking at an index that's like the traffic light, the advantages is that it fits well with both limited and extensive data set species. You can set reference points based on stock assessment parameters. You can set them based on long-term catch models, trend analysis. Its concept in the color scheme with the red, yellow, and the green is fairly intuitive, easy to explain for both professionals and non-professionals. And it does take those long-term fluctuations in the population into consideration. Now, the commercial and recreational harvest for the traffic light analysis typically shows an earlier indication of declines, or has shown an earlier indication of declines compared to the 70% trigger that we're currently using for Croker. And in most cases, it was about 3 or 4 years ahead of time. The levels maybe weren't as abrupt, but you would start to see that decline earlier. And then in the fishery-independent indices, for both adults and juveniles, the variability is higher, particularly in the juvenile indexes, because, of course, you've got recruitment variability compounding it. But you still had a greater degree of sensitivity. And one thing to note, and you'll see this with the figures a little bit in the next couple slides, there were some discrepancies between the harvest indices, which are the commercial and the recreational landings, and the fishery independent abundance indices. And it's all mostly detailed in the full report. However, in a nutshell, you've got a difference in the age structure between the data sets, particularly with Croker. The commercial and recreational Croker catch is dominated by age 3+, whereas most of the fishery-independent indices are dominated by ages 0 through 2. When you take that age structure into consideration, the composite figures for the traffic light analysis match up a lot better, and those trends match up. Okay. So, as I was saying, with the and this is the commercial and recreational composite figure for Croker, and you do see a lot of red on there. But compared to the 70% trigger, it only triggered a few times, whereas you see that the proportion of red, which just represents those annual declines, increasing in recent years, where we had that kind of big pulse and numbers were high throughout the late 90s and mid 2000s. Let's see. And then with the adult index, this would be with the fishery independent indices. You see a similar trend in the 90s with the red, but you start to actually this is where you see that difference. You see a much lower proportion of red, greater proportion of green. This is representative of the difference in the age structure with the two data sets. Let's see. And then the juvenile, this is with juvenile Croker. And this one basically is much more red. Mainly that has to do with you've just got much greater fluctuations in the level of the recruitment year to year, and although in recent years you see, particularly in 2010, 11, and 12, it's really seesawed back and forth. However, the relative level of red in the index is, compared to the adults, maybe a bit exaggerated, just because you've got such a high degree of change in that variability. Let's see. Where am I? Okay. Now, for the update, the commercial and the recreational traffic light was, particularly for spot, was much more indicative of the change than that 10th percentile. The spot fishery, the independent indices, offered a pretty good tool for examining year-to-year changes in the index values, and had much more sensitive reference points that can be set using historic data levels and abundance levels that are known, as well as harvest levels. The current 10th percentile trigger for spot rarely tripped, and when it did, it always occurred at a level that was among the lowest values in the index. And just to give you some examples of this, for the on these figures, this is for the do I have the right? Yeah. The sorry, mine's a little different. This is for the commercial and the recreational harvest. That red line on the bottom is the 10th percentile, and then the blue lines where they overlap are the are where the traffic light boundaries would sit, and how those proportions and whether it's red, green, or yellow are set. But basically, what you can see is that 10th percentile falls fairly low, and so it's only going to trip when those numbers get down pretty far. And again, this is particularly true with spot. Same is true with the fishery independent indices. You see it with the top left one there, which is the NIMP survey, and the CMAP survey on the bottom, where those that 10th percentile is only going to trip, or only tripping, when that index reaches pretty much whatever the lowest levels in the time series. So that, as a trigger mechanism, or using it as a management trigger, is not very effective. Okay, for the traffic light, and looking at these composite diagrams, you'll see the reflects what you saw in the abundance trends on those previous graphs, where you see the increasing proportion in red in recent years for the combined commercial and recreational landings. We have much more limited age data on spot compared to croaker, in trying to differentiate the difference in the age structure between the commercial and recreational harvest data sets and the fishery independent indexes. But for the most part, what we know about size and age range, the same trend holds true, although they don't have the age range that croaker typically do. And then for the fishery independent indices, we see that we actually see the opposite occurring, and this is a composite of the NIMP's Fall Groundfish Survey and the CMAP Southeast Atlantic Survey, also from the fall, where in recent years you start seeing an increase. This is mostly attributable to quite a big increase in the NIMP's Fall Groundfish Survey. Spot have been increasing in numbers in the Mid-Atlantic, basically, and that's definitely reflective in this figure. And they have been increasing in the South Atlantic too, but not nearly at the same rate. An example of how the traffic light method is used, one current example is North Carolina's Blue Crab Adaptive Management Framework. Basically, they implemented the traffic light model such that there are two management level responses, and they're tied to the relative proportion of red within each of those characteristics. And the way they did them at a, what was it? Was it a 50? Yeah, it was at 25 and 50. But basically, the two, did you, oh, okay. The moderate management level response occurs when a proportion of the red for the traffic light characteristic reaches 50%. And this can result in things like limiting harvest, restricting trip level harvest for sponge crabs, instituting minimum and maximum size limits, and then an elevated management reaction would occur when the characteristic reached 75%, or that proportion. And this is just going to result in more restrictive management actions, such as prohibition of sponge crabs, or the peeler, restricting the peeler harvest, or closure of the fishery. And in comparing that to spot and croaker, there are some things that we can use in the same way. Things like size limits, possession limits, and seasonal closures. However, they're not all going to work in quite the same way. In croaker, which is the one that's been up there here, that same tiered approach, the technical committee looked at, and we came up with, felt that it was a fairly viable tool. Now, one thing that the North Carolina does different, their production characteristic is actually related to the recruitment indices and life history aspects of blue crab versus what we're using, or the way we're listing it here in our example is actually a harvest characteristic, which would be the commercial and recreational landings. Now, the level of, for the management response levels for the red proportion, the technical committee came out at 30% for a moderate management level, and 60% for a elevated management level. And we arrived at these, basically, we looked at relative to the different proportion levels, how frequently the index might have tripped relative to how it related to the 70% trigger, and felt that these two levels, at least as a start, represented a pretty good balance between where a lot of changes would occur and how those indexes would trip. But those moderate management levels can include catch limits, which, did we get that up there? Okay, good. Catch limits in numbers for both, or numbers for recreational, pounds for commercial, could also include closures, and those could be specific areas within the state, and then gear modifications. One thing, the effort controls may not be as much of a viable option at least for Atlantic croaker and for spot, due to the inability to enact limited entry or monitor a quota with those species, because they just aren't as closely monitored compared to a lot of other species. So bag limits, size restrictions, and area closures, and possibly gear modifications are probably more effective. And then each level of, similar to the North Carolina one with the traffic light plan, each level of the management response could be enacted on a 3-year time series, and then if those management changes occurred, they could be held in place for three years to provide a consistent measure of coast throughout the coast and allow for sufficient time to evaluate the impact of those measures. And then for spot, very similar. You've got, and one thing we actually didn't make it on this figure was catch limits on the top there, but that would also be included on here. But with spot, they've got a shorter life history, and there's a little less of kind of that one-to-one applicability to that approach, and that's mostly due to the lack of age data. And so the comparison there would be looking at a 2-year time frame and enacting measures over a 2-year period and evaluating them. And considering the management tools and the limited options that are available, again, in constraining effort and trying to improve recruitment, reduction of landings through catch limits, size limits, and those types of things are probably going to be more effective. And in the areas where we have listed for closures, those were determined based on coast-wide recreational harvest estimates by wave over the last 2 years and assessed based on when that harvest was highest. And similar to Atlantic croaker, each of those management responses, looking at them over the 2-year period, you're going to have a better idea of how the management action may affect it. Let's see. Oh, and yes, and then also one other thing, particularly with spot, we do know typically most of the age data sets we have for spot, most of them don't go above age 3, maybe 4 up in the Mid-Atlantic. But, we do have some historical records. I know we've got spot in South Carolina that come out of impoundments that are 6 and 7 years old. So they can live a much longer time. So implementing some of these measures might potentially allow for improving abundance as well as expanding the age structure of the population as a consequence. Okay, and then in conclusion, I know people have planes to catch, so I'm trying to go quick here. But for both species, the application of the overall harvest percentage, or application of an overall harvest percentage reduction using a combination of those management tools that were listed in the tables that we saw before at each tier, could also be an option for a state-by-state management measure rather than implementing it coast-wide. So basically you're saying at those tiered levels that instead of trying to implement that type of thing into coast-wide, you could tell the states, okay, you have to come up with a 10% reduction or something like that, and allow them to make those decisions as another possibility. So the proposed management framework for Atlantic croaker and spot is intended to act as an interim measurement measure between stock assessments and not to be implemented in substitution of a stock assessment. The measures proposed are aimed at addressing the multi-year changes and trends, and the accuracy of their impacts can only be improved through better age data, particularly with spot, and further highlight the need for updated stock assessments for both species. Croaker have actually had a couple stock assessments. Spot have actually never had a baseline stock assessment. However, the traffic light analysis method for use with both croaker and spot do provide, we feel the technical committee and the plan review team for spot provides a better measure of changes in the population and better ways to respond to it, and request that the board review the draft of the management framework and the traffic light analysis for consideration in the interstate fisheries management of Atlantic croaker and spot.
All right. Thank you very much, Chris. That was very informative. We've done something similar with blue crabs in Georgia, and it's worked out really well. I mean, it's something that the industry understands. The concepts are easy for the industry to work out, and the problem we had was we got them to buy into the approach, but then what were the management actions? We spent like 3 years trying to develop those, and that was all-out war. I want to take any comments or any questions you have for Chris at this time. Dr. Daniels.
That's okay. I'm going to bring this up again at this meeting because I'm catching a lot of heat at home for it. And there is the perception, I think, it's a perception, that the reason why we're seeing all the red in the stoplight model, which I don't think surprises any of us, is the shrimp trawl bycatch in the South Atlantic. And I'm wondering if y'all looked at that, considered that. our history in looking at shrimp trawl bycatch for these cyanids is fairly long and sordid, in that we did a stock assessment, and we tried to incorporate bycatch of shrimp trawls in the weak fish stock assessment back in '96, I believe it was, for Amendment 3. And the numbers were all over the board, and so the SALSARC threw it out and told us not to use shrimp trawl bycatch estimates in the stock assessment and just concentrate on age 2+ F. And that's what we've done ever since. So for 15 years now. Then we did a croaker assessment, and as I recall, when we went to the peer review for the croaker assessment, they wouldn't give us they wouldn't consider our biomass estimates because we hadn't considered shrimp trawl bycatch in the assessment. So we've gotten sort of a schizophrenic response from peer reviewers on the validity, the accuracy, the utility of shrimp trawl bycatch estimates. And so, is there any evidence that you are aware of as the technical committee chairman or any member of the board, is there any evidence to suggest that the reductions, the lack, and the problems with spot and croaker right now, not only in North Carolina, but in the further south states, but more importantly in some producer areas north of North Carolina, is directly attributable to shrimp trawl bycatch?
Well, I can't say directly. However, it seems like every time both the spot and the croaker committees meet, we set aside at least a 45-minute time period every meeting to discuss the shrimp trawl bycatch. And as you pointed out with the stock assessment, I mean, this is we did look at that during the 2010 stock assessment, but we were using fish to shrimp ratio bycatch methods, which were not great, but that's what we had. And there were some studies from the early '90s when the first implementations of birds and TEDs, and looking at bycatch effectiveness, and there was some estimates in terms of, and we did try and incorporate that, but we just couldn't get satisfactory estimates of the level of bycatch, and that's where it would hit the snag at the peer review every time. I do know. I was going to say North Carolina has, I think they're in the second, possibly going into the third year of doing a bycatch study, and we're eagerly anticipating the results of that to see if it'll shed some light on this. Some of our original estimates that we did in the stock assessment showed that the bycatch levels were, in some cases, annually greater than the total commercial recreational harvest. So, we know, particularly in the southeast, we know the croaker and spot make up a huge component of the bycatch, but it's just, and that's always on the research recommendations and everything else to get a good, effective look at that, but it hasn't been done yet.
Pat Canfield.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to let the board know, related to that question, the CDAR is holding a procedural workshop later this year to look at shrimp data and the bycatch problem. So they're going to try to answer, a couple questions. Is it possible to do better, South Atlantic shrimp assessments, but also try to get a better grip on bycatch of cyanids and other species? We don't have specific dates, but it's supposed to be sometime in 2014.
There's another one that's coming up before that, a crustacean meeting, a workshop, but the one that you're discussing they're still looking for a date.
Yeah, correct. There's a CDAR workshop. That's what I was referring to, and there's also a CMAP crustacean meeting. So.
Dr. Daniels.
So just to follow up, and you're correct, we are in the progress of a bycatch study. The bycatch is high, as it always has been. Using ratio methods, which nobody really likes. You're looking at millions, tens of millions of individual fish, and what we're seeing in the studies so far is that spot croaker and weakfish tend to be the top three for North Carolina. Now, that may be a little different in the more oceanic conditions of the more southern states where they don't allow as much trawling nearer shore than we do. So, trying to fit all the pegs into the proper holes is going to be difficult on that because we are so variable north to south in the shrimp trawl fishery. But one of the things that we're moving forward with in North Carolina is in 2 weeks, or my commission will be meeting to adopt a new shrimp fishery management plan to require an additional bird of the fisherman's choice, an additional federally certified bird in a net, while we work with industry to come up with new devices to try to increase our bycatch. Our goal is 40%. Now, whether or not we can reach that or not, I don't know. But what continues to be the $64,000 question is we've seen fairly significant reductions in our shrimp trawl bycatch over the last several years, which would make one think that the bycatch problem has been mitigated somewhat by that, along with the reductions from the TEDs and the birds. And we're still seeing this substantive decline in the spot and croaker and weakfish populations. One would think that with all the efforts that have been done through this board and the weakfish board to eliminate the fly net fishery south of Hatteras and have all these reductions in shrimp trawl bycatch in the South Atlantic, that we would have seen some quantified number somewhere, something would have shown a positive result. And I'm not sure we've ever seen any positive result from all of those management actions. And so those haven't done any good to bring around the spot and croaker populations. We've got a hint from the technical committee on what the problem is with weakfish. So I like your approach. I think you did an excellent job. The technical committee did an excellent job. This is exactly what I was hoping to see, very consistent with what Georgia has done in blue crabs and what North Carolina has done with blue crabs. I encourage us to use this information, but I would also encourage us to move forward, as the technical committee, I believe, thinks is appropriate, to schedule at some point in time a spot stock assessment. We have seen 4- and 5-year-old spot fairly recently in North Carolina samples, and in Virginia. So, I mean, Gulf menhaden live to be 5 years old, and they get assessed every year. So, this is an incredibly important fish from, I guess, New Jersey, New York, down to Florida, and they're gone. And so, there's bound to be something that we can do. The big problem we're going to run into is bycatch in other fisheries and how these things are used as bait in a lot of fisheries, and the culling requirements that are going to have to take place in states like North Carolina and Virginia and other multi-species fishery states where they do have a high quantities and size limits are going to create an issue. Those are my comments, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Wilson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've had the benefit of being on the technical committee, so I've heard all of this, and I also commend Chris and the folks that work more directly on it for having done a tremendous job, and I agree with what Lewis said. So my question is, what's the next step? I guess at this point, do we ask the technical committee to go ahead and refine those potential management measures and come back to us at the May meeting with some specifics about what measures would be triggered by those levels? I know they had put 30 and 60% in there as levels for consideration. Does the board need to discuss those further and give them some additional guidance as to what they would like to see in that, or just send it back to the technical committee and say, hey guys, take a look at this and come up with some specific recommendations to which the board can respond?
I believe the TC and the PRT would like the board to give them recommendations of what they want to do with this model, the traffic light analysis model, and potential management actions. And I hear silence.
Actually, I'd like to add one thing that Louis brought up, and that's that with spot in particular, beyond the their importance in the recreational, as a recreational species and commercial species in many cases or in different states. But similar to menhaden, spot is an extremely important mid-level prey species for just about everything. So, and that's something that we've brought up frequently in South Carolina for small cyanid management issues, as a way to get people to pay attention to it. It's like, they're spot. But you know what? They're really important for red drum and striped bass and whatever, everything that's out there eating them. So that's a...
Joe, you had a question?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, just 2 points. Going back to the comment about the spot assessment, and Chris, you should remember this, and Wilson, on some of these discussions the committee's had in the past. I think the only reason the combined committees have never recommended a spot assessment to this date has been because of the bycatch issue and the shrimp trawl, and that trying to get that resolved, knowing that was the problem with the croaker assessment. So knowing they already had a problem in the croaker assessment with it, and spot follows along the almost exact identical data set, they knew it needed to be resolved. I think the North Carolina study, once it's resolved, I would not be surprised to see the committee recommending an assessment not long after they get those results. With that, talking about assessments, when is the next croaker assessment scheduled?
I was going to say it's either 2016, I think, was 15 or 16. So 16.
It's penciled in for 2016.
Okay.
Mr. Woodward.
One thing I think we've got to be very careful about is using any bycatch characterization studies out of North Carolina and applying it southward, as Lewis has already alluded to. I mean, those fisheries are prosecuted very differently, and while everybody's still using the same gear, we've certainly seen shrimper behavior change over time in terms of units of effort expended and how many hours of trawling take place during a trip, and it's going to remain a very elusive thing that we're trying to get our hands around. But it's going to but from a management standpoint, if we were to implement something like this and then it translates into management actions that affect established commercial and recreational fishing for those species, I mean, that's what we're going to get hit with. Well, what's their pound of flesh? What are we going to take away from the trawlers so that there's an equal distribution of the reduction of mortality? And that's going to get very difficult to grapple with because we're not going to have the definitive information we need. I mean, it's nobody's fault. It's just an exceedingly complicated situation. So.
Wilson?
Well, I agree with everything that's been said about bycatch, and I think that the thing we have to keep in mind is while it is very elusive to try and get a handle on, I think that the problem with the rejection of the previous assessments was not because bycatch was included, but because of the variability associated with it and our inability to come up with an estimate of discard that peer reviewers found credible. That was the problem, and Lewis and Spud are both correct. It's a very difficult thing to estimate and to come up with any degree of rigor. But in the interest of moving us ahead here, I think I'm hearing around the table that everybody likes this approach, again, as Chris stressed, as an interim management measure, not a substitute for stock assessments, but something that's better than what we have in place now. And again, the devil's in the details, what levels you want to set for management measures. And I guess for spot, we really don't have any, we don't have a size limit in place, I don't think, right now. That we've discussed maybe an 8-inch limit. I think, Chris, you might help remind me there. And so
yeah.
It seems to me, Mr. Chairman, that in the interest of efficiency, the best thing to do might be to give the technical committee a positive signal that we really like this approach and give them the latitude to refine the list of potential management measures and bring them back to the board at the May meeting if the board's not prepared to go ahead and discuss them and select from that table that you already prepared or presented to us today.
Wilson, would you consider an addendum?
Yeah, is that the process, Bob, we would have to use? We would have to do an addendum to basically adopt the traffic light approach as a substitute for the present management triggers that we're using for these two species?
That is correct, Wilson.
Okay. Then would you entertain a motion to that effect, Mr. Chairman?
Let me get Joe.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a quick question. I'll direct this up to for the TC. Is there any concern from the TC with whether the assessment's 2 years or 3 years off for Croker, that if we change our trigger strategy midstream before that we're going to have any impact on the data inputs to the assessment?
The short answer to that is no.
Okay.
I can't say that the issue has been specifically discussed, but we've discussed just about everything else, and that concern has not been brought up as something that would be an issue, so I wouldn't think so.
Thank you.
Back to Wilson.
So then, Mr. Chairman, I guess I would move that the board task the staff and TC with development of a draft addendum that would employ the traffic light approach, which they have developed for use in management of Spot and Croker. And this would be with the understanding that this would be used as an interim approach until we have approved stock assessments for both species.
Joe, second. Second by Joe Grist. Let's wait till we get it all up there. Okay. Any discussion? Lewis.
Could we, if Wilson's all right and Joe's all right, I think it would be clearer maybe, to say develop a draft addendum that will adopt and employ the traffic light approach. That way, we're doing an addendum that changes it from the method we use now to the traffic light, and would give us the ability to go ahead and select management measures based on what the TC's recommendations are.
Wilson?
Yes, I'm fine with that, Mr. Chairman, as a friendly amendment. And Lewis, the one other thing that occurred to me is, do we need to say anything in there about tasking the TC to provide a suite of management options for our consideration, or do you think that's understood when we ask them to develop the draft addendum, that would be part of that?
Tony?
Wilson, I think it's understood, but it might be helpful for the technical committee and the PRT for you all to give them some direction. They have given you guys some examples of what they've put together, and then they were asking you all for feedback on, do you want us to go higher or lower? What range are you all looking for?
The ranges that they included in there were fine with me, but they're again, in the interest of full disclosure, I was part of the group that discussed them and helped develop them, so I would love to hear feedback from other board members as to whether they think those levels are appropriate, or not conservative enough, or too conservative, or what.
Russ?
Well, obviously, I think you should have, when you're developing an addendum, you have your status quo, and you might have different percentages in there. I've looked it over a little bit. I can't say that I've been studying the traffic light approach, and we haven't used it in New Jersey too much. I think the 30% and 60% are fine, but maybe a couple of 15%, 45% just to fill in the gaps. That's pretty similar to other species that we've done. We can do those kinds of approaches if that's okay.
when we looked at when we were looking at those kind of proportion levels, actually on the figures, on the horizontal grid lines were all in the 10% increments, because we were trying to figure out, okay, you don't want it tripping too much, but we don't want it, not like the 10th percentile. You don't want it tripping once every 40 years when it just absolutely crashes. So that's. And then we looked at the way we've been doing it with, say, the 70% trigger with Croker, and how often that had been tripped, and so that there could be some continuity going from one to the other, and they're just not, going off to something completely different. But yeah, I think in moving forward, we'd take a much deeper look at those proportions and where things change and how frequently based on those the whole time series.
Lewis.
Yeah, I'd like to see the PRT and the technical committee look at, I think, the range of options of status quo, maybe 25-50 and 30-60, and then consolidate the reports like you've done in your presentation for spot, and then indicate where we've tripped triggers, and then what those management measures would be, and then do the same thing for Croker. And then what I would find particularly enlightening would be if all the stars align and we end up putting this into place, and we end up monitoring spot and Croker with the traffic light approach, then we get some better estimates of shrimp trawl bycatch that we may be able to include in a Croker assessment, and then a spot assessment, and then see how the stock assessment reflects what we did with the stoplight approach. And was it close? Were we heading in the right direction with the stoplight approach? Because for a lot of these data poor species that we all deal with, not only at this level but at our home level and the commission council level, this could be an opportunity to show the utility of that method that is far less data intensive and far less complicated, for lack of a better term, and it's something that the fishermen generally can buy into and agree. So if we find that those assessments are consistent with what we've done with the stoplight, that would be very valuable information on two stocks that right now, I think we're seeing pretty extraordinary and historic lows in those populations.
Are you suggesting that we have those specific percentages put into the motion, or? No, just as direction as I think as Tony said, they were looking for direction from the board to the TC and the PRT, and that was my intent of my comment. Wilson?
Well, perhaps if my seconder would agree, if we just add after the word addendum, stick a comma in there and put with an appropriate suite of management options, comma, then maybe that gets us to where we need to be. Is that sufficient guidance to the technical committee, Chris? And just we've talked about what some of those are. Those are on the record. Russ mentioned some, Lewis mentioned some. So I think that would be, from my perspective, that seems to be sufficient guidance to the TC. And the only thing we haven't really talked about is when we did put the table together, we did not put any numbers in there in terms of a potential size limit for spot or potential bag limits for spot, but there again we routinely just put, pick a range in there of status quo, which would be no size limit, to whatever the minimum would be to allow reproduction at age 1 or something like that. I don't know whether that's 6 or 8 or what, but those are the kinds of things I think we would expect to see included in the addendum for the board's consideration and for public input, I guess.
Okay. Mr. Woodward.
How about bag limits for the two of them? I mean, I don't see those
Yeah, we left those with an X too, Spud. We had it in the table, but we didn't pretend to begin to discuss those. And I know right now there are none, I guess, for either species. And I know Lewis in particular, North Carolina, and probably the other South Atlantic states as well have fairly significant and large pier fisheries for these species. And it's not uncommon for people to depart the pier with several coolers full of spot and or croaker. So there again, I'd look to the TC for advice on that point. You know, what sort of numbers. If board members have any thoughts on that, that would be good to give the TC some further direction.
We actually do have a bag limit. It's 25, which is obviously a very liberal bag limit, but it's a bag limit nonetheless. So, and we're leaving shrimp, trawl, bycatch off the table for management. I'm just want to make sure of that. I mean, because you start talking about closures of this, closures of that, I mean, is that...
Wilson is...
Well, I think, Spud, based on the record that we've generated today, I don't think we're leaving it off the table. I think we clearly said that North Carolina's got a study underway, and as soon as that study is completed and the TC has an opportunity to look at the results, I think we said what we'd like to do is go ahead and generate a new stock assessment and try to come up with a defendable estimate of bycatch discards. You know, so to me that's not off the table. That's just saying that for this interim measure, for the moment, you know, unless we run into something unanticipated, that I think the suite of management measures that's proposed at the moment doesn't include addressing the bycatch directly, although we know North Carolina is attempting to address it by making some changes to their trawl fishery. And again, I guess North Carolina right now, from the standpoint of the amount of trawling that's going on in inshore areas where they're encountering large numbers of juvenile cyanids, is probably, that's the place where most of it is happening, because South Carolina and Georgia and Florida all have management measures in place that greatly restricts the amount of inshore trawl use, so it may be less of an issue there. I don't know. But I wouldn't say we're taking it off the table. I would say we're just deferring consideration of it, maybe. But I would leave that up to the technical committee. I mean, if there's some management measure that could be put in place that addressed the commercial side, then fine. I don't know what that would be at the moment. And I don't remember, Chris, that we talked about that a whole lot.
We in what we discussed in at least for commercial fisheries, it definitely did not really, I don't think any of the discussions had the shrimp fishery in mind. It was looking at more like bait, the directed bait fisheries, scrap fisheries, and things like that. And at this point, I don't think the technical committee would probably would be comfortable trying to put a management action in that would in some way, shape, or form impact the shrimp fishery, because we just don't know. I mean, we know there's an issue, but we don't have the data to support it, so we can't necessarily start telling them what to do.
Lewis.
Yeah, I think my thought would be that, with the traffic light approach, we would address those issues that the technical committee has already developed, and then if and when we get a stock assessment that incorporates shrimp trawl bycatch, and we can point to a definitive impact of shrimp trawl bycatch on those stocks, then we might have to go back and start looking at better mousetraps on bycatch reduction or something else. But I see that 3-4+ years down the road before we go in that direction. That's my thought.
Joe?
Just a point on the motion. As on the last line, this will be an interim approach until the next stock assessment. Well, I know Croker has a next stock assessment, but Spot's not on the list. So is this implying that we will now put on the list Spot for a stock assessment?
That would be up to the board. And it's not scheduled at any time.
It's not on the stock assessment list currently.
Where are we, Tony, how far along are we on the list? How late does it go?
2016.
2016? Okay. So we're looking at, and is that staff recommended to the policy board in the action plan?
Management and Science Committee makes those recommendations to the policy board.
Okay.
Wilson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Is that really a problem? I mean, the fact that one's not scheduled, that just means this is good. The traffic light approach is going to be our management approach until there is one. We know one's coming up for Croker, at least one's scheduled for Croker within a couple of years, so we could deal with Croker once that assessment is completed, and then we would just continue to use this method until at some point, we have sufficient amount of data to do a spot assessment if that's something that the board decides they want to do. But I guess I don't see a problem with it. I think we've heard pretty definitively that this approach is better, would be a more effective management tool than what we have in place currently. So to me, this represents progress. And if we can't afford to go ahead and schedule and do a spot assessment, and we may not have sufficient data to do a spot assessment, then this would just remain in place, wouldn't it, until at some future date when we do have the resources to do a spot assessment. I don't know. I don't see that as a huge problem, but correct me if I'm wrong.
Lewis?
Yeah, let's take care of this. My suggestion would be to take care of this motion, and then I'd like to have some more discussion on that because that's going to bottle up this motion. I think if we want to move forward with this approach, because I do have some comments on a possible option with a spot assessment.
Well, also, the FMPs are independent of each other, so that's something to consider. So the motion stands. All right, I'm going to read the motion. Move that the board task the staff and the TC to develop a draft addendum with an appropriate suite of options that will adopt and employ the traffic light approach to manage Spot and Croker. This will be an interim approach until the next stock assessment. Motion by Dr. Laney and seconded by Mr. Grist. All those in favor? 2, 3, 4, 5. Opposed? Abstain? Null? Okay, carries unanimously. Yes.
We haven't we've tasked the staff with a lot of stuff this week. And Bob and I have talked about this, and I think Bob and Doug and I are going to be sitting down and prioritizing, what we're going to be able to accomplish by the May meeting. It's my intent to put this as one of my priorities, so we'll see how it carries out to the May meeting after our discussion. But we haven't tasked the Management Science Committee with anything this week, and I don't want them to feel left out. And so what I would like to do is make a motion that the South Atlantic Board request the Management and Science Committee consider.
It's actually the Assessment Science Committee. I lied to you.
Oh, it's the Assessment Science Committee, not the Management Science. Well, we haven't tasked them with anything this week either.
We did task the Management Science Committee.
Oh, we did? But not the Assessment Science. So just
we get them again.
Yeah. The Assessment Science Committee consider developing a spot benchmark stock assessment. And I'm up for any perfections. Tony.
We get a second by Russ. There you go. Okay. Dr. Laney.
Just a process question, Mr. Chairman. I know normally it would be we would have this done by a stock assessment subcommittee of the spot plan development team or technical committee. I don't recall that we have tasked the assessment science committee with doing a stock assessment. There's no reason we couldn't, but I just thought I'd ask the process question.
Pat?
I mean, we do not have a spot stock assessment subcommittee because we haven't attempted an assessment yet, but I believe a spot TC could, members from that could.
We don't have a spot TC.
We need to develop an assessment team. We'll seek nomination.
Okay. Any other comments on the motion? Those in favor, raise your hand. It's going to be everybody. Let's get this quick. Those opposed? No. Carried unanimously. Okay. All right, moving on to the next item is the consideration for the FMP reviews and the state compliance reports.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In the interest of time, I'll try to go through these quick, but again, if you have any questions, feel free to stop me at the end. First is the spot FMP review. As was noted by the traffic light analysis, we've been noticing declines in both commercial and recreational landings. In 2012, total landings were estimated at 3.2 million pounds, a decrease of 59% from 2011 and a 60% decrease from the previous 10-year average. For 2012, the breakdown was approximately 39% commercial and 60% recreational. Virginia accounts for the highest percentage of any state for both recreational and commercial landings. With regards to recommendations, research and monitoring is top priority, as was noted in the previous agenda item. So other elements are to continue state monitoring and reporting on the extent of bycatch and fishing mortality, and to evaluate the effects of mandated bycatch reduction devices. With regards to state compliance and de minimis, the PRT finds that all state compliance reports are consistent with the Omnibus Amendment. And in terms of de minimis criteria, state qualifies for de minimis status if its past 3 years average of the combined commercial and recreational catch is less than 1% of that combined commercial and recreational catch during that period. When states qualify for this, they are not required to implement any monitoring requirements, which none of them are included in the plan. Current requests for de minimis were South Carolina and Georgia for the 2012 fishing year. The PRT finds that these states meet the de minimis criteria. That's for spot. If there's no questions, I'll move on to spotted sea trout. Seeing none. With regards to spotted sea trout, a coast-wide stock assessment has still not been conducted given the largely migratory nature of the species and lack of data on migration and where it occurs. State-level stock assessments have been conducted for Florida, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Georgia in the past years. With regards to the commercial and recreational breakdown, from 2002 to 2011, commercial landings averaged approximately 292,000 pounds. In 2012, commercial landings were estimated at approximately 408,000 pounds, which represented a 161% increase from the previous year's harvest and approximate 40% increase from the previous 10-year average. North Carolina accounted for approximately 65% of the total coastwide catch, with Virginia and Florida comprising the next largest at 19% and 15%, respectively. Regarding recreational catch, the catch and release of spot and croaker has had a strong upward trend, increasing from 1.1 million fish in 1981 up to 8.8 million fish in 2012. Harvest has remained relatively stable at about 1 million fish. In 2012, the recreational harvest was approximately 1.8 million fish. And Georgia anglers take approximately 29% of the harvest, while North Carolina has the second highest of that at 27%. Recommendations with regards to research and monitoring, continuing the state-specific stock assessments is key in collecting data on size and age data, as well as work on stock structure at the regional level. Next, the other priorities, but not quite as high, are identifying essential fish habitat requirements and working to better understand environmental factors that might have influences on the stock status. Because it's part of the Omnibus Amendment as well, spotted sea trout and Spanish mackerel, the PRT finds all state compliance reports are consistent with the Omnibus Amendment, and in turn the de minimis requests, the de minimis requirements are the same. The state of New Jersey requested de minimis status, and the PRT finds that New Jersey has met that criteria. Are there any questions? No questions. I'll move on to Spanish mackerel. The last stock assessment for Spanish mackerel was CDR 28, and I don't believe the board was given an update on that. Essentially, as you can see in the charts above, the BMSY has recently, in the last 7 years, gotten above the target, and the overfish ratio currently is below the FMSY. As such, the resource is determined to not be experiencing overfishing, and the stock is not overfished for the Atlantic Spanish mackerel. With regards to landings, next slide. Total landings in 2012 were approximately 4.7 million pounds. The commercial fishery consisted largely of this harvest, whereas the rec side was 30%, commercial was approximately 70%. Spanish mackerel total landings represented less than a 1% increase from 2011, but an approximate 9% decrease from the previous 10-year average. With regards to commercial numbers, as was noted, commercial numbers make up largely the bulk of landings at 3.5 million pounds, with Florida having the highest percentage of that at 73%. With regards to recreational landings in 2012, 835 Spanish mackerel harvested in numbers of fish, with Florida harvesting approximately 30% of the total coastwide. With regards to recommendations, again, research and monitoring are high priorities with regards to length, sex, age, catch per unit effort for improving stock assessment accuracy. Evaluating weight and length at age data is also critical, and the development of fishery-independent methods to monitor stock status, or stock size, and then last, medium priorities, yield per recruit analysis is also something that the PRT noted. Last, PRT finds that all states' compliance reports are consistent with the Omnibus Amendment, and states requesting de minimis status are New York, New Jersey, Delaware, and Georgia, and the PRT finds that these states meet the de minimis criteria. I'll take any questions if folks have them now. One other thing to note, that the PRT requests that these FMP reviews and state compliances be approved, as well as the de minimis status requests.
Are there any questions or comments? Okay, we're going to need a motion. Mr. Woodward?
Do these need to be done separately, or can they be bundled all together? Because I can bundle them real easy. Okay. In that case,
I think we can, If you close your eyes for a minute, it's basically that you can do the FMP review and the state compliance reports as one, and then the de minimis criteria as a separate motion. So.
Okay. All right. I move we accept the state compliance reports for spotted sea trout and Spanish mackerel as presented.
Second.
Second by Dr. Daniels. Okay.
Spud was the motion.
Any objection? Hearing none.
And then
Motion's carried.
was the. Was there anyone who voted against it? No. Was it unanimous?
I just didn't. There was no
Okay.
objection.
Okay. And then we need to.
Ready for the next one?
Yeah.
Move to approve the de minimis request as presented for spotted sea trout and Spanish mackerel.
Second.
Second by Dr. Daniels.
It's on the second slide I was showing you. Yeah, motion carried unanimously. There.
Okay, I'll read this one real quick. Move to approve the de minimis status for the states of New York for Spanish mackerel, New Jersey Spanish mackerel and spotted sea trout, Delaware Spanish mackerel, South Carolina for spot, Georgia for spot and Spanish mackerel. Motion by Mr. Woodward, seconded by
Dr. Daniels.
Dr. Daniels. Daniel, forgive me. Any objections? Seeing none, motion's carried.
Great.
Okay,
Last item is the Virginia.
Okay. Last item we have on the agenda is second to last, is the proposed change by for Virginia for the red drum commercial management measures for 2014. I'll turn it over to Kirby first.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The next item is the Virginia proposed commercial red drum measures for 2014. I'll just wait a sec till we can get it up on the board. So with regards to just a quick background on the red drum, Amendment 2 to the FMP was approved in 2002, and it set about a few requirements for state compliance. The major one for management measures was with regards to size limits. Maximum size limit for red drum was at 27 inches. And the other key component was that states must have measures in place that keep the spawning stock ratio at approximately 40%. And so that can be done through the combination of slot limits and bag limits. I have a table at the end of this that if anyone has any questions on how that ratio was calculated, it was done back in, I believe, 2000, but it's in the amendment. So with regards to Virginia commercial landings over the last 5 years, this gives just a breakdown of how it's fared with regards to coastwide. Red drum is managed in two regions essentially. There's the northern and southern. For the northern region, which is the states of North Carolina through New Jersey, recruitment at age 1 has fluctuated widely without any apparent trend since about 1989. The trend in the 3-year average SSPR indicates that it was low at the beginning of the time series from about 1990 to 1997, and that since then the average SSPR has been well above the overfishing threshold, which is approximately 30%, so the SSPR is set at 40, with the exception of just 1 year, which was 2002, and that since then it's been considerably higher than that. There is high probability that the stock in turn is not subject to overfishing, and that the average SSPR is likely well above the target, as I mentioned. With regards to Virginia's proposal, it's included in the meeting materials, but the change is in that 2013 Virginia's slot limit was 18 inches to 26 inches and a 3-fish possession limit, and the proposed measure is to reduce the slot limit by 1 inch and increase their possession limit by 2 fish from 3 to 5. The technical committee reviewed this proposal, and as was mentioned in the memo, it's largely done to reduce the discard mortality rate. All technical committee members were in agreement that the proposed measures don't propose significant risk to maintaining the spawning potential ratio of approximately 40%. The only concerns TC members had raised was with regards to the language in the Amendment 2 for allowing states to make changes to their measures. And it was pointed out that there are at least 2 sections within Amendment 2 that allow for states to have alternative management regimes so long as they achieve an approximate 40% spawning stock ratio. These are in Section 4.5, which is the alternative state management regime, and 4.6, adaptive management. In terms of next steps, the board must consider, Virginia asked the board to consider approval of their proposed measures, commercial measures in 2014. And I would ask that if anyone has any specific questions about this proposal, we have Joe Grist in attendance, and he'd be happy to expand on anything that I just provided. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Kirby. Does anybody have any questions? Lewis.
I'm trying to go back in an old file box in my head. We have a 1 fish bag limit, 18 to 27, and that meets the criteria. So just dropping the upper bound 2 inches gives you 5 fish. Is that? Yeah, I'm just would like to.
Can we maybe enlarge that a little bit?
Never mind.
Okay. Joe, is there anything you want to add?
I'll offer a motion when the board's ready.
At your pleasure.
Move to accept Virginia's proposal to lower its commercial maximum size limit from 26 inches to 25 inches. If they're ready up there. And increase the Virginia commercial possession limit from 3 fish to 5 fish. Whole thing? Move to accept Virginia's proposal to lower its commercial maximum size limit from 26 inches to 25 inches and increase the Virginia commercial possession limit from 3 fish to 5 fish.
Joe, while we wait for that to get up, is that just for 2014 or ongoing?
Ongoing.
Ongoing.
And I'll just put a point of clarification to the board while that's getting up. We still have to take this to our own state commission and for public hearing. So this isn't a done deal out of this board. We still have to get it through our commission process. So we could still end up at the same place we are right now. But this allows us to move forward with that process.
Okay, is there a second to that, Martin?
Joe, if you can just clarify that the motion is correct in terms of...
Marty Carey.
See? Yeah, letting him perpetuity look kind of good to us. That looks correct.
No, it was by Marty Carey. By Mr. Gary. Second. Any other discussion? All those in favor, raise your hand. All those opposed? That looks like it's unanimous. Motion carries. Okay, last but not least, we need a vice chair. Mr. Woodward.
I'd like to nominate Jim Estes from the beautiful Sunshine State of Florida.
Second.
If there's no other considerations, all those in favor?
Let me try. Move to close nominations, and I cast one vote for Jim Estes.
There we go. See no objections, motion carried. Is there any other business to come forward this board at this time? Daniel.
Just one real quick thing. As most everybody's was affected by the polar vortex, we had some pretty substantive ice down in North Carolina, and when that ice started to melt on Friday and Saturday, we had probably the biggest cold stun event on speckled trout that I've seen. Very widespread, what was termed catastrophic in some water bodies. And so I issued a proclamation on Monday that went into effect Wednesday at noon, closing the fishery for everybody until after peak spawning, which we define as June 1st. So it's going to be closed until June 15th to try to let what made it through the cold event to spawn this spring. So it's part of this board's purview, and I just wanted to let y'all know what we had done.
Okay, thank you. Anything else? Motion to adjourn. We're done. Safe travels, everybody.